Welcome everyone to Unit 1 Content Review. I want to start by letting you know the purpose of a content review. It's not to go over the specific content in each chapter, but rather we're going to talk about some test-taking strategies, and we're going to talk about how you can use your course materials to help prepare for the exams. A great place to start with our discussion is going to be about NCLEX style questions. These are the types of questions you're going to see when you take the NCLEX, which is your licensure exam. So we give them to you all the way through the nursing program to get you ready for it. So not only are we preparing you for content, but we're also preparing you for the types of questions you're going to see. If this is your first nursing course, these are going to be new types of questions for you. They're going to look a little bit different. If you've been in nursing courses before, then you've seen these. So hopefully this review will help you as you study for not only this course, but other courses as well. So with NCLEX style questions, watch out for absolute words, things like always or never, especially in true-false questions. For example, carbohydrates are always bad for you. True or false? Well, we know we're not supposed to eat a lot of carbohydrates, but they're not always bad for us, so that would be false. So be very careful when you see always or never. Those are key words to watch for in the stem of your question. The next type of question you'll see is a patient teaching or client teaching question. And again, when you see client teaching, you know you're going to be talking to your client, but be very careful in the stem of your question. If the question asks you that the client needs further teaching, out of your 4 statements, you've got to look for the one that's incorrect. Meaning, if the client needs further teaching about carbohydrates, then maybe our correct answer would be the client states, "I'll never eat carbohydrates again." Well, we know that our clients can't just stop eating carbohydrates altogether. So that would be an incorrect statement, which would mean we would need to tell our client no and teach them more about carbohydrates. That means they need further teaching. If the client understands the teaching, then we're looking for the correct statement. That means the other 3 statements will be incorrect. So that correct statement with regards to carbohydrates might be, the client states, "I will limit the number of carbohydrates I have in my diet." Okay, well, we do know that we want them to limit the carbohydrates. And this is content we'll talk about in one of our discussions, but I'm trying to give you some examples that'll hopefully help you understand. But yes, that's correct. The client does understand that about the carbohydrates when they stated that they will limit the number of carbohydrates in our diet. So that's the correct statement. But when you find your correct statement, always make sure you look at the other statements as well to make sure that they are incorrect. Okay, and that leads me to other statements being correct. Be alert for words in your stem that are telling you that all of the answers are correct. Okay, how does that work? Well, you're not imagining this. In nursing questions, sometimes we will have all 4 answers correct. Okay, but one of them is going to be most related to the stem. You're going to see words like most likely, best, first. For example, if we're talking about a nursing procedure, and we're talking about, let's just say, wound care, and the stem of the question asks you, while providing wound care to a patient, what is the first thing that you will do? When you see that, think to yourself, okay, all 4 answers are going to be related to wound care. So they're all going to be correct when it comes to wound care. But then you've got to look at the answers and say, okay, but what am I going to have to do first? So that can be a little confusing. Okay, or you may be talking to a patient about a psychosocial issue, and it might say, what is the best response to give? Well, maybe all of the responses could be correct in one way, shape, or form, but there's always going to be one that's going to be the best one to say. And as nurses, we have to make those choices every day in our career about what is the best thing to say. Or, I've got to do wound care. What's the first thing I need to do? And that kind of goes into priority questions. What would be the most important thing to do? For example, if a patient's having difficulty breathing, and the question asks you, what is the most important thing to do? Maybe 4 of your answers would have things to do with helping them breathe. One of them might be sitting them up in the bed. One might be putting oxygen on them. One might be check their oxygen status. All of those things are correct when it comes to oxygen. But what's the most important? Okay. And if you want to know the answers to that one, it would be to sit them up first. And the rationale, again, would be to Sitting them up is one thing that you can do quickly. Going to get oxygen or checking their oxygen status would require you to leave the room for a minute to get equipment. So the priority at that point would be to sit them up to promote breathing. Again, if this is your first nursing course, you'll see more about that in future courses. But what I wanted you to know is that when all of the answers are correct, look for the most important, look for the first, but look for the key words in your STEM to understand which answer is going to be correct. And then practice your NCLEX questions. Get a book. We've got plenty of apps on our phone that we can download. You've got lots of resources with your publisher. Practice the questions. The more practice you get, the more comfortable you get with questions and the content. But one thing that you've got to learn to do is don't be satisfied with just getting the correct answer. So you see a question, you pick the right answer, and you're like happy with it, and you move on. Don't do that. Stop. Not only look at the question's correct answer and understand why the correct one is correct, but also look at the other responses. Many nursing resources will actually tell you why the other responses were incorrect. So if you can understand not only the question and the correct answer, but understand exactly why the other responses were incorrect, then you've got a better grasp of that concept overall. So now you're probably wondering, how in the world am I supposed to think like an expert nurse? Well, we're not expecting you to think like an expert, but we do want you to start thinking like a nurse. After all, that's your ultimate goal, to become a nurse. So don't think about what you see on TV shows. We're not going to run around like Code Black or like ER, but we are going to have to stop and think about some situations and come up with some great ideas and some great answers because we need to take care of our patients. Remember that everything you learned in nursing school, even in the core before you got to nursing school, it's all cumulative. It's all going to build upon itself. For example, in this course, what you learned in Unit 1, you're going to need to think back and recall it when we get to Units 5 and Unit 8. You're also going to find that you need to recall that information for other courses, not just in this term, but in future terms. So what we really want you to do is take all the information you've learned in all of your previous courses, and that means math and English and psychology and all the different courses, anatomy, and we want you to take that foundational knowledge and start categorizing it. Start applying it to different areas of nursing. If you try to memorize information, you don't remember it quite as well, and then you can't apply it to situations. So start categorizing your information, start applying it to other and new information, and you'll be okay. So again, you may wonder, why NCLEX questions? Why can't I just have normal questions like I did in anatomy and physiology? Well, like I mentioned before, at the very, very end of this program, you graduate. But you only graduate with a degree in nursing. You're not actually a nurse. The final test is that big NCLEX, that licensure exam that we're preparing you for. And they have their own type of questions. So the responsibilities of a professional nurse actually start the very first day you start nursing school. And it continues all the way through the curriculum and then continues throughout your career. You're going to be a lifelong learner. You're going to continue to learn even after you graduate. Why do you think we give you a license? You test to get a license, and that license tells everybody that you now are a nurse and you can think like a nurse because you've passed the nursing exam. You've been able to think through that exam and you're safely able to give patient care. And this class, 228 or nutrition, it's part of the learning plan. Every program has outcomes. And the program here at Chamberlain, we have a program plan, and every course you take is part of that plan. And if you want to see that plan, you can always get with your advisor and they can tell you exactly how the plan goes, but you've probably seen it when you saw the courses you're taking and when you take them. And to start thinking like a nurse, you have to have all those courses together and you have to be able to put all that information together and become a BSN nurse. But I will warn you, this course has lots of definitions. So break out those index cards. Some of the definitions you're going to have to memorize. But once you've memorized the definitions, you're going to remember those and categorize them, like I mentioned in a previous slide, to be able to actually apply those to patient scenarios. So how do you study for this course? Remember earlier I asked you to think about your learning style. Think about how you learn and how you can use your course resources. The first thing I recommend is to print your lessons. Print out what the outcomes are going to be for this particular module. Look at those outcomes. Then go and look at the review of knowledge. That's part of your lesson. Look at the objectives. Look at the learning plan. Then look at the tables in the textbook. Those tables summarize information. They don't summarize the whole chapter, but they do take a lot of key concepts and put them in a nice, neat table to help you organize your thoughts. Look at the key concepts at the end of the chapter. That summarizes information for that chapter. Is there new stuff that you don't remember reading about when you read that summary? If so, go back and look in that chapter. Okay. Remember your flashcards? Keep those flashcards out for definitions, because those definitions will be applied to concepts, okay, and actually applying care and making decisions. If you're a visual learner, sometimes the pictures in the textbook will help bring a visual component to your concepts. Remember, we do discussion questions every week, and the actual discussion questions don't cover every single portion of the test material, but you will find, if you remember in an earlier slide, or if you remember thinking back to our welcome recording, I mentioned that during the discussions, you're going to see me add in additional questions to you. I'm going to take information you may have posted and ask you to expand on it. I'm going to turn your head into a different direction and say, well, what about this? Or I'm going to ask you a whole different question. I might have a question for the day that might be completely different from our discussion question for the week. Those are additional resources to help you get ready for the exam. Those are additional concepts that you need to have a grasp on. So pay attention to all of the different things that we offer in this course, in addition to NCLEX type books and the resources from your publisher, in addition to ATI information. All of the information together will help you put together the big picture in this course and in nursing in general. When you start a module, the first thing that I recommend that you do is to look at the unit outcomes. So for example, in Unit 1, our unit outcomes, the things you need to know when we get through this unit. We're going to look at the role of nutrition in health promotion and wellness. We're going to look at factors that influence nutrition. Then we're going to discuss alterations in the digestive process and how that can affect nutrition. And you'll see that our discussion question is related straight with this one. Then we're going to look at the balance between daily intake and energy needs. So by the end of this unit, you should be comfortable with these 4 unit outcomes. And if you look beside each unit outcome, you'll see CO for course outcome. So you'll see that each unit will match a certain course outcome, and by the end of this course, you will have met all the course outcomes. So start here. This kind of gives you an idea of what we're expecting you to know by the time you get through with this module. So once you've looked at the unit outcomes and you've seen how they relate to the course outcomes, you want to move on to the content outline. And that content outline, there's a link to that in your syllabus, but this is going to tell you exactly the specifics of how we're going to meet those unit objectives that we just talked about. And those objectives, again, are in that first column in the content outline, the determining the role of nutrition, health, promotion, and wellness, examining factors that influence nutrition, discussing alterations in the digestive process, and there's a second page that we'll get to on the next slide. But in that middle column, it's going to tell you all the different areas that we're going to cover that are going to make sure that we cover all of those particular unit outcomes. So as you're studying for the exam and you're looking at these different areas in the center column, have we talked about all those areas? If we didn't talk about them, have you read about them? Have you taken notes on them? Do you understand those? This is about as close as you can get to having an actual test map for your exams. And this is just the second page, continuation of the previous slide, because the center column for D got cut off due to lack of space. So again, more concepts that are going to relate back to those unit outcomes. In other words, do you understand about factors that influence nutrition, the socioeconomic, the cultural, the age, etc.? Do you understand energy balance and how energy is balanced with eating habits, exercise habits, and physical fitness? These are all concepts that you're going to be tested on. Okay, so our next step after looking at the unit outcomes, then looking at the content outline, we're going to break into our reading. And it's very important that you actually sit down and read your textbook. While we give you a lot of resources and we give you recordings and we give you NCLEX style questions, we give you discussions, it's really important that you first sit down and actually read the chapters in the book. This gives you a great foundation for the information. So for this particular module, we're going to be reading 3 chapters. Chapter 1, which is Wellness Nutrition. Chapter 2, which is Personal and Community Nutrition. And then Chapter 3, Digestion, Absorption, and Metabolism. And if you look at the names of the titles of the chapters, they look pretty close to what our unit outcomes are going to be. Let's take a look at Chapter 1. Just give kind of an example of maybe some ways that you can use the chapter to help you study. First thing you notice is it's about wellness nutrition, and it's about 16 pages long. And do you remember that the lesson plan said that we're going to learn about the role of nutrition, we're going to look at health promotion, we're going to look at wellness and nutrition. So that goes back to the title of our first chapter, Wellness Nutrition. You can kind of see now how all of our things are linking together. As you begin to read Chapter 1, you notice that it starts off with what the role is of the nurse in health and wellness, and what's the definition of health. As a primary caregiver, it's going to be one of your responsibilities at the bedside to recognize an incorrect diet or maybe symptoms of malnourishment. And once you recognize these, it will be your responsibility in part to help provide appropriate instructions to your patients while they're there or when they go home on how to eat responsibly. But you've got to understand the concepts first. You're going to reinforce dietary recommendations in the overall context of the nursing plan. And when patients go home, we don't want them to come back because of nutrition problems. We want to prevent them from being readmitted. So by you understanding nutrition and as it relates to each patient based on their diagnosis, based on their age, based on their socioeconomic status, based on all these factors that you need to understand nutrition will help you teach these folks how to maintain a well-balanced diet and to prevent readmission and hopefully prevent medical complications that are related to malnutrition or poor diet. So you'll hear the term health thrown around a lot throughout this course and probably all of your other nursing courses. And nutrition is very important to health, but there's 6 different dimensions of health we need to consider when it comes to any kind of a medical condition, nutrition included. The first is physical health, which is the efficiency of the body to function appropriately, to maintain immunity to disease, and to meet daily energy requirements. Then we've got intellectual health, which I'm hoping all of you are healthy in. But intellectual health is the use of intellectual abilities to learn and to adapt to changes in one's environment. Then there's emotional health. For example, the capacity to easily express or suppress emotions appropriately. We've got social health, which is the ability to interact with people in an acceptable manner, kind of like you will when you have your group assignments, and also to sustain relationships with family members, friends, and colleagues. Then we've got spiritual health, which is cultural beliefs, and those beliefs give purpose to human existence. These are often found through faith in the teachings of organized religions. They can be found in an understanding of nature or science, or it could be in an acceptance of the humanistic view of life. And finally, there's environmental health. And environmental health deals with external factors that affect our health and well-being. This can include the physical context within which one lives and works. It can be determined by ethnicity, education, income, occupation. It can extend to a larger environment, maybe of safeguarding natural resources, trying to reduce exposure to preventable hazards. And then we want to look at independent activity. There's a teaching tool on page 2 that talks about independent activity. And that teaching tool will help you understand the 6 dimensions of health. Okay. When you get a chance, as you're studying, make sure you review the Unit 1 lesson section. It's called Living a Healthy Lifestyle. It gives you some great information and perspectives on nutrition, and especially how it relates to the 6 dimensions of health. In an earlier slide, I mentioned to you that if you're a visual learner, that sometimes the pictures in the book will help you study. So for example, here is a picture that's on page 3 of your book. And it kind of gives you a good idea of what a wellness effort roller coaster looks like. So if you'll look at the beginning, if you're exercising regularly, you're sleeping 7 hours, you're eating good foods, and you're getting together with friends, which of course doesn't sound like a traditional nursing student, but do the best you can, you'll see that these folks are kind of on a high on the roller coaster. They're up and they're having lots of fun. When exams come around and you get too little sleep and you get less exercise, you'll notice that the roller coaster goes down. Wellness starts to decrease. Then we start planning ahead and we get plenty of wholesome food, and the roller coaster starts to go up again. Of course, then exams come again and there's no time to shop for food, and you don't get to sleep, and there's no exercise, and it seems like everything goes crashing down again. But this is kind of how wellness works, based on nutrition, based on sleep, based on exercise. And this is a great way to understand what happens to your body based on being able to get sleep, based on being able to exercise, based on eating correctly. And this is a great picture to kind of give somebody a mental idea of, okay, these things affect me positively, these things affect me negatively. Next, the chapter focuses on health promotion and as it relates to nutrition. If you think back to our unit objectives and you think back to our course outline, health promotion and as it relates to nutrition was on there. So now you can see how they're linking directly again back to the textbook. The first thing you have to understand is what is health promotion. And basically those are strategies that are used to raise the level of health of individuals, families, groups, and communities. So we're looking at getting communities, individuals, groups to change their patterns of behavior so they can become healthier. And that, of course, links as well to nutrition. On page 5, you'll see that there's box 1.1 talks about Healthy People 2020. You may have heard that. That is basically a government mission that's out there. It's goals, and the vision is to create a society which all people are living longer and healthier lives. And you'll see in that box there's different specifics to what that mission includes. For example, the mission might be to identify a nationwide health improvement priority. What are some things we need to improve nationwide for health? Another would be to look at critical research, evaluation, and data collection needs. But we're trying to get to the overarching goals of attaining a high quality, longer life free of preventable diseases, disability, injury, and premature death in our patients and our communities, achieving health equity, eliminating disparities, and improving the health of all groups. We'd like to create social and physical environments that promote good health for everybody. And of course, promoting the quality of life, we'd like to promote healthy development, and of course, healthy behaviors across all life stages. And this fits directly in with our nutrition because we've learned in the last slide that if you get healthy nutrition or healthy foods and you eat them on a regular basis, it can help prevent diseases, it can help promote healthy behaviors. So again, we're linking our content in our book back to our unit objectives and our content outlines. And this is how you need to be using our textbook to study directly for these exams. As you move away from the table on page 5, you'll read into the chapter. You'll not only see what we talked about in the previous slide about what the goals and the missions are of Healthy People 2020, you'll also see that the book tells you as well that there's often some misinterpretation about these initiatives. So for example, what you may not see in the box is actually discussed in the actual writing of the textbook. It tells you that these goals that you see in the box are not meant to cure diseases. Instead, the aim is to set goals and implement strategies to help decrease morbidity and mortality, which will ultimately decrease the burden of healthcare on society. So this is how you would take the table or the box in the chapter and link it directly to the written content to create a big picture about the concept. The next thing chapter 1 talks about is health literacy. So why is health literacy important? Well, we have to understand that health literacy is the ability to acquire and to comprehend basic health concepts, such as nutrition, and apply them to one's own health decisions. So as you are looking at our discussions in this course, for example, sometimes in the weeks we're going to ask you to formulate teaching plans or to teach your patients what is best when it comes to nutrition. But before you can formulate the plan, you've got to stop and think, can the patient understand what you're saying? And can they understand the plan you're putting together? If they don't have adequate health literacy, the ability to put this information together, what you're teaching them becomes basically um, obsolete. It would be like trying to teach something like statistics to a third grader, an average third grader. Um, so you want to make sure you assess your patient's ability to understand before you begin to teach them. Know the audience you're talking about. Know who you're talking to. Assessing that health literacy is the first thing you have to do. If we're talking to a teenager, we don't want to talk to them as if they were a 5-year-old. But if we're talking to a 5-year-old, we don't want to talk to them like they're a teenager. If we're talking to somebody who's a little bit older, we want to speak to them with respect, but still make sure we're using terms that they can understand. Don't assume because somebody is a certain age that they can read. Okay, we've got to look at their ability to comprehend what we're saying and what we're giving them. Don't always assume that they can understand what you're saying, but also don't assume that they can afford the food you're trying to recommend. If you've ever gone on some type of a special diet, you can see that trying to eat healthy sometimes can be very expensive. Fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, lean meats, those are expensive foods. So as we look at our discussions and we look at our patients each week, when you're starting to make recommendations for foods that they can eat, make sure you're looking at, can they afford what you're recommending? Or is what you're recommending so far out of their price range that they may listen to you and understand, but they're not going to be able to follow it because they can't afford it. So look at, again, that whole picture of your patient. That whole picture is called holistic nursing. So next we move on to the next part of our lesson plan, which is the digestion process. And to understand the digestion process, we're going to have to know the organs that are involved and what their functions are, the glands that are involved, what their functions are, enzymes that are involved, what their functions are, the chemical and physical digestion, what they are, how does it work, what happens if one of these organs or glands or enzymes is absent or doesn't work, how does that affect the digestion process. But you'll notice that this particular part of the lesson plan is covered in detail when we do our Unit 1 discussion. So you're going to see me ask additional questions, but you should get the entire digestion process and what would happen if one or more parts of it wasn't working when you answered the discussion question for Unit 1. So that's covered in Chapter 3. Use Chapter 3 extensively as you're writing your response. Use external outside resources, professional resources as you're writing your response. And you'll notice that you've covered this part of the lesson plan. Okay. The next part of our lesson plan, or C, is eating well. So we're looking at recommended daily dietary allowances. We're looking at the website myplate.gov. We're going to look at things like food safety, consumer information like labels, different biotechnology, handling food, preparing food. This is all in Chapter 2. So as you're going through Chapter 2, you'll see all these different areas that are covered. Make sure that you refer back to this lesson plan, refer back to Chapter 2, and make sure that you understand all of these different areas as they relate to the information in the chapter and that you're able to apply them to a patient scenario. As you're looking at our lesson plan and our contents, you'll notice that you can't accurately understand how to instruct about proper nutrition or understand proper nutrition or talk about Healthy People 2020 or look at the digestive process if you don't understand the different essential nutrients. And this is why I want to refer you to this particular slide, because I told you that in your book you've got some tables that are in there that really summarize information. All of these things, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and water, they're all basically discussed throughout your textbook. But when you're looking for sources of these essential nutrients, this is a great table to start with. So if I ask you a question about a particular type of lipid, you would learn that linoleic acid is a lipid. Or if we're talking about the various types of proteins that are in your body, here's a good laundry list of those proteins so you could recognize the different types of proteins. A good way to remember these is to do a index card, and you can list, for example, lysine. On the back, you can put protein. So you can kind of link these different vitamins. We've got fat soluble, meaning that when you take a vitamin, you've got to eat something with some fat in it, or drink a glass of milk, something with fat. Or we've got water soluble, and it's important to know the difference between these two because it will make a difference as far as being able to metabolize and absorb these vitamins. The different minerals that we're going to talk about all the way through this textbook, they're all listed here. So basically, this is a great way or great example of how information that's spread out through a chapter or throughout the book is compiled into one table. And this table, by the way, is on page 8 if you want to see that. As we progress through the book, you'll see that foods are pretty much categorized by the predominant food group that they're in. So you'll need to know the difference between the food groups and be able to identify which food group a specific food would fall into. You'll also need to understand that whole foods are foods that are very different than processed foods, whereas your whole foods are foods that are very limited when it comes to processing. They're more natural, and you'll need to understand the difference why whole foods are often better than processed foods and how that whole foods affects digestion and nutrient absorption. In our content outline, we talked about energy is something we'll be talking about and how nutrition affects energy. I told you that There are going to be some things that you just have to memorize, and this is a table that you absolutely have to memorize. In order to understand how much energy comes from each food source, you need to understand the kilocalories per gram. And this is something you'll be asked on multiple exams and be able to understand how each of these types, for example, carbs, proteins, fats, and alcohol, how they relate to the kilocalories. But then we got to go back to a previous slide where I said you need to understand which food falls into which category. So for example, if I told you that we were going to be eating 5 grams of a potato, we know a potato is a carbohydrate, we would know that 5 grams would have 4 kilocalories per gram. That would be 20 kilocalories. So you want to be able to put the food in the category and then understand how many kilocalories per gram you get for each category. So memorize this table. This table is on page 8 of your textbook as well. Now taking those nutrients that we just talked about one step further, you know, we had the overview that was on page 8 that we talked about a couple slides ago. We talked about how each of them contribute as far as energy goes with kilocalories. Within those nutrients as well, you're going to see that we have to be able to distinguish that carbohydrates are a major energy source. As we move further through our textbook, you'll have to be able to determine a simple versus a complex carbohydrate, and that's going to come in one of our discussions in one of our weeks during our course. So you'll be talking about simple versus complex, because remember, I talked about not all carbohydrates are bad for you. So we'll talk about simple and what that means when it comes to diet. Proteins are going to be huge in this course. They're a form of energy. They basically provide us with major structure and function in the body. But you're going to find that we have some essential proteins and non-essentials, and you'll be able to distinguish between the two of those. When it comes to fats, those are our densest form of nutrients. Things like the triglycerides, the phospholipids, and the sterols. And within those, you'll be able to identify which type of foods are phospholipids, which ones are sterols, what functions that they provide in the body, because yes, we also need fats in moderation. We have to talk about vitamins and how they assist in releasing energy. And again, just like in the previous slide, we talked about water soluble versus fat soluble. We'll also talk about what role they play in the body, what foods they're in. Same thing with minerals. They give structural function to the body. We do have major ones. We also have trace ones. We'll talk about which ones you need more of. We'll talk about what their functions are. We'll talk about what happens when you have deficiencies. Same thing with vitamins with deficiencies. We'll talk about foods that contain it, because we're talking about nutrition. We're not talking about just supplements here. We'd like you to get all of these 6 major nutrients in your diet. And then we absolutely cannot forget about water. We'll talk about fluid and electrolyte imbalances. We'll talk about dehydration. You know, our body can't function without water. It is the fluid in which all of our other functions occur. So we'll talk about what happens or how we can tell if somebody's dehydrated. We'll talk about foods that contain water if somebody doesn't like to drink a lot. So you'll see that these are our 6 major nutrients, and they're going to make up the bulk of our course. And we'll talk about them in health. We'll talk about them in wellness. We'll talk about them in illness. Excuse me. You'll want to know where you can get these in your foods, when to avoid them, how to tell if we have a deficiency, how to tell if we've got too much. So this is kind of where we're going to start building our knowledge about nutrition. Earlier, we talked about Healthy People 2020. We talked about prevention of diseases and getting a healthier population. In this first unit, we're going to talk about levels of prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary, and what is included in each of these levels. You'll need to understand the different levels and be able to identify a specific activity. Was this primary, was this secondary, or was this tertiary? For example, primary, we're trying to promote health. We're trying to protect folks from disease processes. So for example, preventing our children from becoming diabetic. If we're talking about secondary, we want to catch a diagnosis early, get treatment early, and hopefully prevent that diagnosis from getting any worse. So for example, if I have a teenager who is pre-diabetic, they've been diagnosed it, we want to catch that early. Then we want to get them some prompt treatment, whether it's dietary modifications or whether we have to do some type of medication treatment. but we're trying to catch it early so that we can prevent it from becoming a complicated case of diabetes later. If we're talking about tertiary, we're talking about maybe the disease has already gotten complicated and we're trying to restore them back to better health and do some type of rehab techniques. So let's say, for example, somebody has become extremely obese and their diabetes has gotten uncontrolled. And for tertiary, we're going to do aggressive medications, exercise therapy to try to get them to where we can keep their blood sugars under control. That would be a tertiary level of prevention. So make sure you understand the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary and be able to identify factors that play into those and activities that are associated with each. When it comes to specific terminology related to dietary standards, these are some phrases that you'll need to understand. For example, the estimated average requirement. You might see that on a label. You might see that in the stem of a question. But if we're talking about the estimated average requirement, or the EAR, we're talking about the amount of a nutrient that's needed to meet the basic requirements of half of the individuals in a specific group. So we're looking at a population and we're saying, okay, based on this specific group, the amount of nutrients needed to meet the basic requirements. And we use half because we can't meet everybody, but we try to get the population in general. The recommended daily allowance, you've probably seen RDA, especially on a label. That's the level of nutrient intake that's sufficient to meet the needs of almost all the healthy individuals of a life stage and gender group. So RDA will change based on the life stage and the gender. So for example, calcium needs in a younger female may be different than an older male, but you'll need to understand what RDA means. Adequate intake, or AI, that's the appropriate level of an average nutrient intake determined by observation of or experimentation with a particular group. So basically we take a group of folks and we say, okay, we're going to see what their adequate intake is. We're looking to see, is that going to be enough to keep them healthy, keep them disease free? So your adequate intake of a nutrient. The tolerable upper intake level, that's saying, okay, that's the most you can take in of a particular nutrient to prevent an adverse health risk. Because everything we need in moderation. Even though protein is wonderful, if we take in too much, we have a problem. If we take in too much fat, obviously we have a problem. So there's a certain level we say, okay, we'd like you to get a lot, but there's a certain level that above that we can start having health risks. And then finally, there's an acceptable macronutrient distribution range. That's a little bit more complicated to understand, but it basically means that it's the percentage of energy intake values for macronutrients for fat, carbohydrates, and protein. Okay, for these nutrients, we have a range that are set, ranges that are set to provide adequate energy and nutrients, but still reduce risks of chronic disorders. So for example, if we're talking about the range for carbohydrates, we'd like our carbohydrates to be 45 to 65% of our kilocalorie intake. If we're talking about fats, we'd like it to be somewhere between 20 to 35% of our daily kilocalorie intake. If we're talking about protein, well, between 10 and 35%. So we have a range. If we go below that, we're not eating enough. If we go above that, we're eating too much. So we'd like it to keep within that range. But make sure you understand these 5 different phrases and what they mean, because you might see those in the stem of your questions. And they do mean different things when it comes to nutrients. Other important concepts to understand, not only for this module, but building into future modules, are the terms undernutrition. Okay, you may not have heard of undernutrition, but undernutrition is when we don't consume enough energy or nutrients in comparison to the DRI values. Again, going back to those concepts we talked about in the previous slide, those dietary reference intakes. We're getting not enough energy with those values. That means we're not eating enough food to take in all of the essential nutrients, or eating enough food for energy, but choosing the ones that lack certain nutrients. Okay, overnutrition then. This is when we're taking in too many nutrients and too much energy in comparison to those DRI values. Okay, typically in the US, Americans overconsume saturated fats. Of course, we know that's a risk for heart disease. So again, that would be overnutrition when it comes to fats. Malnutrition is a little bit different in the fact that it's a condition that results from an imbalanced nutrition or energy intake. It can be both undernutrition and overnutrition, but actually leads to a condition. And for example, an obese guy who consumes an excessive amount of kilocalories, he's malnourished because his intake is out of balance. And what you're seeing that because now he's obese. If we just have maybe a normal person that eats a little bit too much or a little bit not enough in one day, that doesn't lead to malnutrition. But when we get to a point where we have, for example, obesity or we have diabetes, we have a condition where that undernutrition or overnutrition has led to a disorder, either too thin, too heavy, diabetes. If we're talking about things like our hair falling out, that's what malnutrition is. And as we move forward, we're going to talk about specific signs and symptoms that you should be able to recognize when it comes to malnutrition. What we're trying to get here is moving our patients towards a positive nutrition lifestyle. And if you've not heard the term self-efficacy, it's by Alfred Bandura. And self-efficacy is a belief that you can do something. So for example, if we empower our patients with information about nutrition, we give them a positive self-efficacy. The I can do this, I can eat right. Okay, so we want to encourage them with our knowledge and give them the knowledge to avoid undernutrition, to avoid overnutrition, to avoid becoming malnourished in general. And that's by giving them improved self-efficacy. As we conclude the lesson plan, we notice that D is living well. So we're looking at factors that influence nutrition. Factors like socioeconomic factors, culture, age, gender, etc. We're going to look at energy balance. How does energy balance with eating and exercise and physical fitness? And as you're reading chapters 1, 2, and 3, see if you can address each of these areas. See if you can think of a socioeconomic factor that would influence nutrition. For example, maybe it's going to be their income. If they don't have a high enough income, then they might not be able to afford healthy foods. If we're talking about age, for example, what if we've got a patient who's a little bit older and is unable to shop on a regular basis? So as you're reading these 3 chapters, go back to this lesson plan. Make notes out beside the factors that influence nutrition. Can you think of some of those? When it comes to energy balance, how do eating habits affect your energy? Find this information in chapters 1, 2, and 3 and make notes out to the side. How does physical fitness affect energy? How does energy affect physical fitness? Look at it both ways. Make some notes. So in summary, what we've talked about, learn how to read those NCLEX style questions. Go back and review the different pitfalls I told you to watch out for. Look at the hints. Look at the unit objectives. See how they relate to the course objectives. This is what you're going to be required to learn this particular unit. Look at that content outline. Use that as a study guide to help you make sure you understand all of the content that could be presented on this exam. Read those chapters. Link that information in the chapters to that content outline. Take notes. Use index cards. As you're studying, if you don't quite understand something, write down those questions as you read and study. Write them down and bring them with you to that live session that we'll have at the end of the week. If you don't come to the live session, it's going to be hard to answer your questions. Okay. Remember, if no one shows up for the live session, nothing gets recorded. There's nothing for you to watch. So make sure you show up. If you have a question but you're unable to attend the live session, don't forget we have a questions and answers section in our course. Go there, post your question there. I'll be glad to answer it there. If you look in each module, there's a review of knowledge posted for each unit. Again, it goes over the concepts in this module. Use all of your course resources. Remember, we've got review of knowledge, we've got content outlines, you've got ATI, we've got outside resources like NCLEX books. I'm a resource. Use me when you need to be. If you've got questions, please feel free to ask. So hopefully this particular review for this week will help you understand how to study for this course and how to study for this module. Next week we'll talk about Module 2. I will post the date and time for the live review for the end of this week, And in addition, I'll post the live review for the RUA assignment.